Sergeant Major Jack Callahan, retired, had run out of road in the Ozark Hills of Missouri with $17 in his pocket and a ghost in his head. He'd inherited a flooded quarry nobody wanted, a place his father had abandoned half a century ago. On the second day, his scarred war dog, Rogue, a Malinois who'd pulled him from a burning Humvee in the Korengal, froze. The dog stared at a steel plate on the quarry floor, and behind it waited a secret sealed for 40 years that would drag Jack back into the only life he'd ever truly known, a life of watching and waiting and ending things. Comment a number from 1 to 10 and tell us where you're watching from tonight. The road that led Jack Callahan to the quarry was paved with ghosts. The first was the ghost of his career, 30 years in the Army, most of it in the 75th Ranger Regiment, ending not with a parade, but with a medical discharge and a quiet handshake. The doctors called it traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress, a clinical alphabet soup that tasted like ash and cordite. Jack called it the Korengal. He carried that valley in the bones of his skull. It was the low whine of a predator drone in the hum of a refrigerator, the phantom weight of his body armor when he stood up too fast, the smell of diesel and hot metal that would rise off summer asphalt and drop him to one knee. It was the face of Specialist Peterson, a kid from Ohio who'd been 19 for exactly 4 days before an IED turned their striker into a metal coffin. Jack had been the first one back in, pulling out the living and the dead, and the fire had taken something from him the Army could never replace. Rogue, his dog, had been there too, a frantic ball of muscle and fur, dragging at his collar, pulling him back from the flames just before the secondary explosion. The dog had a scar along his flank to prove it. Jack had scars you couldn't see. The second ghost was his wife, Sarah. She had tried for years to live with the man who came home from that last deployment, a man who slept in 2-hour increments, who checked the locks 3 times before bed, who would go silent for days. She loved the man he had been, but she couldn't reach the man he'd become. The divorce papers were the final, quiet admission of that fact. After that came the ghost of his daughter, Chloe, her voice on the phone growing more distant with each call, her pleas for him to get help becoming a sad, repeating echo of his own failure. He'd stopped calling, not out of anger, but because he couldn't stand the thought of her tethered to a sinking man. He'd worked odd jobs, security, stocking shelves, bouncing at a dive bar, but the ghosts always found him. A car backfiring, a crowded room. He lost jobs, then apartments. He ended up living in his truck, an old Ford F-150 with more rust than paint, Rogue sleeping in the passenger seat, his warm, steady breathing the only thing that kept the nightmares at bay. When the truck finally died on a cold November morning outside of Joplin, he sold it for scrap and started walking. He had run out of money, out of road, and out of reasons. That's when the letter found him, forwarded from the last VA clinic he'd visited. It was from a county clerk in Stonebridge, Missouri, a town he'd never heard of. It said his father, Daniel Callahan, was officially declared dead, and he was the sole heir to a single piece of property, a 40-acre limestone quarry. The place was less an inheritance than a sentence. He'd taken a bus as far as he could and walked the last 10 miles, the lawyer's letter a stiff, formal paper in his pocket. The county clerk who handed him the deed was a man named Elias Vance, a thin, tired man with glasses thick as bottle bottoms. He peered at Jack over the rims, his gaze taking in the worn boots, the faded surplus jacket, the hard set of his jaw, and the quiet, watchful Malinois at his side. "You military?" Vance asked, his voice dry as old paper. Jack just nodded. "Your father was too," Vance said, pushing the papers across the worn oak counter. "Army. Came back from Vietnam and bought that quarry. Lived out there like a hermit." He paused, tapping a pen on his desk blotter. "Folks said he was guarding something, or hiding from it. Can't say which." Vance leaned forward, his voice dropping. People have come asking about that land over the years. Slick-looking men in nice cars. After your father disappeared, they came even more. Offered cash. The county always said no, long as he was just missing. Now it's yours. He gave Jack a long, searching look. Place has a history, just so you know. The price of the deed transfer was a $10 filing fee. Jack paid it with the last of his cash, leaving him with $7 and a piece of useless land. He walked out into the cold Missouri air, the deed in his hand feeling both heavy and worthless. A final, cryptic message from a father he'd never known. The quarry was a wound in the earth, a sheer 100-foot drop of gray limestone on 3 sides, a gravel ramp on the 4th leading down to a pool of water so dark and still it looked like a plate of obsidian. Rusted skeletons of machinery, a rock crusher, a conveyor belt, lay half submerged in the water, monuments to a forgotten industry. The only structure was a small, tin-roofed shed perched on a ledge 20 feet above the waterline, its windows boarded over. It was ugly and abandoned, but it was solid. The wind couldn't get through the thick plank walls, and the roof, though rusted, looked sound. It was more than he'd had in months. Jack pried the boards off a window and climbed inside. The air was thick with the smell of dust and mice and something else, something metallic and oily. A single room held a steel-framed cot, a pot-bellied stove and a wooden crate. That was all. It was enough. He swept it out, patched the broken window with a piece of salvaged tin, and by nightfall, he had a small fire going in the stove, its warmth pushing back the damp chill. He shared a can of cold beans with Rogue, the dog eating his half with a quiet dignity. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt something other than tired. He felt the quiet satisfaction of a defensible position. He was surrounded by high ground, with one clear line of approach. It was a good place to hold, or a good place to die. He wasn't sure it made a difference anymore. The first night, the storm rolled in. A hard, driving rain that turned the gravel outside to mud and hammered a frantic rhythm on the tin roof. The sound was too much like gunfire, too much like the shrapnel hitting the side of the striker. Jack found himself on the floor, hands over his head, the smell of burning diesel filling his lungs. He was back in the valley, the air thick with smoke and screams, the world reduced to fire and noise. Then he felt a wet nose push hard against his cheek, and a heavy weight settled on his chest. Rogue. The dog was whining, a low, urgent sound, licking his face, his paws planted firmly on Jack's torso. The solid, living pressure brought him back. The roar of the fire became the roar of the rain. The screams became the howl of the wind. He sat up, gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in the thick fur. "Easy, boy," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'm here. I'm okay." The dog just whined again and licked his hand, his presence an anchor in the storm of Jack's memory. It was on the second day, after the rain had passed and a weak sun was trying to burn through the clouds, that the dog began to act strangely. Rogue had always been a working dog. He didn't bark without reason. He didn't move without purpose. But now, he was fixated. At the base of the quarry, near the water's edge, was a wide, flat ledge of rock that served as a natural loading dock. Set into the center of it was a rectangular steel plate, about 4 feet by 6 feet, thick and rusted, held down by heavy bolts. Rogue stood over it, perfectly still, his head cocked, his ears forward. Then he let out a low growl, a deep-chested rumble that Jack hadn't heard since their last patrol. He whined, pawed at the edge of the plate, then looked back at Jack, his intelligent brown eyes filled with an urgent certainty. "What is it, boy?" Jack said, walking over. "Just an old cover." He dismissed it. probably access to an old pump or a drain, but Rogue wouldn't let it go. He paced back and forth, sniffing intently at the seams, his tail rigid. He refused to leave the spot, even when Jack called him. For the rest of the day, the dog lay near the plate, watchful and tense, occasionally letting out that same low, guttural growl. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. The dog's certainty had unsettled him. A trained detection dog didn't false positive. Rogue smelled something, or heard something, that didn't belong. Before dawn, Jack was up, a heavy crowbar from the rusted-out crusher in his hand. He went back to the plate, Rogue trotting anxiously at his heels. In the gray morning light, he saw things he'd missed the day before. The bolts were newer than the plate, their hexagonal heads still sharp, coated in grease to ward off rust. The plate itself was old, but the welds that sealed its edges to the surrounding steel frame were thick, messy, and far too recent. It was a patch job, and a heavy-duty one. He knelt down and knocked his knuckles against the center of the plate. The sound wasn't the dull thud of steel on rock. It was a faint, hollow boom, a low-frequency resonance that vibrated up his arm. There was a space underneath. Rogue whined again, a high, sharp sound of confirmation. Jack looked from the plate to the dog, and a cold knot of understanding tightened in his gut. His father hadn't just lived here. He had built something. He had hidden something. And the wary clerk's words came back to him. Folks said he was guarding something. The dog knew. The dog always knew. It took him 2 days of hard, punishing labor. The bolts were torqued down with an inhuman tightness that suggested a pneumatic wrench. Jack didn't have one. He had a can of penetrating oil he'd found in the shed, and a long-handled socket wrench he'd salvaged from the cab of a derelict dump truck. He'd wedge the wrench onto a bolt, then slip a 4-foot length of pipe over the handle for leverage. He'd put his entire body weight into it, his muscles screaming, until the bolt would surrender with a tortured groan of metal. There were 16 of them. Each one was a fight. Once the bolts were out, the plate still wouldn't budge. The welds held it fast. He needed a grinder. He found one in the back of the shed, a heavy-duty antique with a frayed cord. There was no electricity, but the shed also held a small gas-powered generator. It was dry, the tank empty, but it looked serviceable. He spent the better part of a day cleaning the carburetor and the fuel lines, siphoning a little gas from a rusted can he'd found. To his surprise, the generator sputtered to life on the third pull, its clattering roar echoing off the quarry walls. He ran a cord down to the ledge and went to work, the grinder throwing a shower of orange sparks into the gloom. The noise was deafening, filling the bowl of the quarry, and with every inch he cut, a part of him screamed that he was broadcasting his location to the world. He ignored it. He had to know. When the last weld was cut, he jammed the crowbar under the edge of the plate and heaved. It lifted an inch, then settled back. It was heavier than he'd thought. He found a better angle, got his legs under him, and put his back into it, the same way he'd lifted a collapsed wall off a pinned soldier years ago. With a final groaning scrape of metal on rock, the plate tilted up and over, landing with a deafening clang. Beneath it was a dark, square opening and a steel ladder descending into blackness. The air that rose from the hole was cool, dry, and smelled faintly of ozone and old paper. Rogue peered into the darkness, whining softly, but made no move to enter. Jack rigged a flashlight to his jacket and started down. The ladder was solid, bolted to the rock. 10 feet down, it ended on a smooth concrete floor. He was in a small, man-made chamber, about 10 feet by 10 feet. The walls formed from the quarry rock itself, but sealed with a thick layer of sprayed concrete. It was completely dry. In the center of the room were 4 large black pelican cases, the kind the military used for sensitive equipment. Beside them sat a green steel footlocker. He ran his light over the pelican cases. They were locked, but not with anything a crowbar couldn't solve. He pried the first one open. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, were gold bars. Not coins, but small, heavy ingots, each stamped with a serial number and a fineness mark. He opened the other 3. More gold, and in the last one, thick bundles of bearer bonds, currency from a dozen different countries, and stacks of American $100 bills. The old-style notes, crisp and uncirculated. It was a fortune. More money than he had ever seen. His hands were trembling as he turned to the footlocker. It wasn't locked. He lifted the lid. On top lay a neatly folded flag, the 48-star version from his father's era. Beneath it were records. Daniel Callahan's honorable discharge from the U.S. Army, 5th Special Forces Group, dated 1973. A citation for a Bronze Star earned in a place Jack had only read about. And a thick, leather-bound journal. He opened it. The first entry was from 1975. I bought the Quarry today. It's far enough away. No one will find it here. No one will find me. Jack sat down on the cold concrete, the beam of his flashlight shaking, and began to read. His father's neat, disciplined script told a story that dismantled Jack's entire life. Daniel Callahan hadn't been a deserter or a drunk who ran out on his family. He'd been an operator on a deniable intelligence mission, part of a team tasked with guarding a covert Cold War contingency fund. A treasure trove meant to finance stay-behind networks in case of a Soviet invasion. But the mission had been compromised from within. His own commanding officer, a major named Silas Croft, had tried to steal the cash for himself. Daniel and one other loyal soldier had managed to escape with a portion of it, going to ground, each man guarding a share, waiting for a signal to return it that never came. The other soldier had been found and killed years ago. Daniel knew Croft was still looking for him. For this. He's patient, Daniel wrote. He has resources. He will never stop. The last entry was dated 15 years ago. I'm getting old. Croft is getting closer. I feel him circling. If you are reading this, Jack, it means he found me. It means I failed. But this is not his money. It belongs to the good men who died for it. Use it for them. Don't let him have it. And at the very bottom of the page, a final, chilling sentence. The deed is the key. Croft wants the land because he knows it's here. He forged the first survey. He doesn't know where. He just knows it's in the rock. Don't trust anyone who asks about the deed. The discovery of the chamber changed everything. The exhaustion that had settled deep in his bones was burned away by a new, cold energy. It was the feeling he got before a mission, a hyper-awareness that sharpened the edges of the world. He was no longer a homeless veteran waiting to die. He was a sentry on a post, guarding his father's legacy. He spent the next day securing his position. He hauled the generator back to the shed and camouflaged it. He moved the footlocker and one of the Pelican cases into the shed, hiding them under a false bottom he built into the wooden crate. The rest he left below, resealing the heavy plate, scattering dust and gravel over the seams to make it look undisturbed. He couldn't hide the fresh scars from the grinder, but from a distance, it was passable. He kept a single gold bar and a small stack of hundreds, tucking them into his pack. Leverage. Options. That night, he didn't sleep in the cot. He took a position in the shadows at the edge of the quarry rim, wrapped in a blanket. Rogue, a silent, dark shape beside him. He watched the single dirt road that led to the property, his senses on a razor's edge. Just after 0200 it happened. A pair of headlights appeared at the far end of the road, a mile away. They didn't approach. They just sat there, the beams cutting twin cones through the darkness, the engine a faint, almost imperceptible rumble. Jack watched them through the cheap pair of binoculars he'd found in the shed. He couldn't make out the vehicle, only the light. They sat for 10 minutes, an unnerving, patient stillness. Then, the lights clicked off, and a moment later, they clicked back on, flashed twice, and the vehicle turned around and drove away. It wasn't a lost traveler. It was a signal, or a surveillance sweep. They were checking to see if the property was occupied. The next morning, he found more signs. Down by the main gate, a heavy chain held together by a thick padlock, he found a fresh cigarette butt in the mud. A filter-tipped brand, expensive. Not his. More telling was the chain itself. One of the links had a fresh, bright gash in the metal, the kind left by a pair of bolt cutters that had been stopped mid-squeeze. Someone had been about to cut their way in, but had been interrupted or had thought better of it. They were probing his defenses. The direct approach came 2 days later. A gleaming new Ford F-250, black and polished, rolled slowly up the access road, stopping just short of the gate. A man got out. He was in his late 60s, tall and fit, with a full head of silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He wore a crisp flannel shirt, clean jeans, and expensive leather boots. He looked like a man playing the part of a rugged country gentleman. As he approached the gate, Rogue, who had been lying quietly beside Jack, rose to his feet, a low growl vibrating in his chest. "Easy, boy," Jack murmured, putting a hand on the dog's back. The man stopped at the gate, cupping his hands around his mouth. "Hello, the Quarry. My name is Silas Croft. I'm a local developer. I was hoping to speak to the owner." The name hit Jack like a physical blow. Silas Croft, the name from his father's journal, the man who had hunted him for decades. Jack's blood ran cold, but he kept his face a mask of neutrality. He walked down the gravel ramp, Rogue pacing him, the growl never ceasing. "I'm the owner," Jack said, his voice flat. Croft's smile widened, but his eyes were busy, scanning every detail of the quarry, the shed, the equipment, lingering for a fraction of a second on the ledge with the steel plate. "A pleasure to meet you," Croft said, extending a hand through the gate. Jack ignored it. "I've been trying to acquire this property for years. The county was always a dead end. I heard it finally passed to an heir. I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer. Say, $250,000 cash." The offer was too high, too fast. It was a test. Croft wanted to see if he was just a desperate man who would snatch the money and run. "Not for sale," Jack said. Croft's smile finally faltered. "Every man has a price," he said, his voice losing its friendly veneer. "This place is a wreck. It's worthless. I'm doing you a favor." "I like the quiet," Jack replied. His gaze locked on Croft's. He could see the flicker of frustration in the older man's eyes, the predatory calculus working behind the mask. "Think it over," Croft said, his tone now cold and clipped. "I'll be back. You'll find I can be very persuasive." He turned without another word, got in his truck, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the air. The first intrusion was over. The war had begun. The confrontation with Croft lit a fire under Jack. He was no longer just guarding a treasure, he was hunting a ghost from his father's past. He used the cash from the footlocker to buy a beat-to-shit but mechanically sound Chevy S10 from a farmer 2 towns over, paying in cash and giving a fake name. He also bought a burner phone and a laptop. He needed information, and he couldn't risk using his real identity. He drove to the county seat, a larger town named Harmony Springs, and went to the records office. The clerk on duty was a woman in her late 70s, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind her spectacles. Her name tag read Mary Beth Aiken, County Archivist. "Can I help you, son?" she asked, her voice surprisingly strong. "I'm looking for old property records, specifically for a quarry near Stonebridge. The old Callaway Quarry," he said, using the name on the original deed. "Callahan," she corrected him gently. "Daniel Callahan. I remember him." Her eyes softened with a distant memory. He was a quiet man, kept to himself, came here after the war, same as my late husband. He had those same haunted eyes you do. She looked at him knowingly. He disappeared about 15 years back. Just vanished. Left everything behind. Jack felt a pang of connection to this woman. She saw him. I'm trying to piece together what happened to him, he said, deciding to trust her. I heard a man named Silas Croft was trying to buy the land. Mary Beth's face tightened at the name. Croft, she said, the name tasting like something sour. He's a big man around here now. Owns half the county. Calls himself a developer, but he just buys up land and lets it sit. He came in right after Daniel vanished, waving around a deed of sale, claimed Daniel had sold it to him just before he left. It looked legitimate, but the signature was a forgery. I knew Daniel's hand. I told the sheriff, but he said it was all in order. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The sheriff, Bill Taggart, he's Croft's man, always has been. The forgery was good, but not perfect. I kept a copy of the original deed transfer to Daniel, the one with his real signature. Something told me to. She went into a back room and returned a few minutes later with a dusty file. Inside were the two documents. The difference was subtle, but it was there. A slight tremor in the forged signature that wasn't in his father's steady hand. Croft has been acquiring land from people who have problems, she continued. Old folks with no heirs, people who get into legal trouble. Then they either move away quietly or they just disappear. Like Daniel Callahan. She had just given him the pattern, the proof that his father was one of many. He thanked her, his mind racing. Croft wasn't just a thief. He was a predator who used the system to cover his tracks. The threat escalated the next day. Jack returned to the quarry near dusk, a sense of unease crawling up his spine. The lock on the shed door was intact, but he noticed a small scratch near the keyhole that hadn't been there before. Inside, everything seemed normal, but his training screamed at him. He did a slow, methodical search. Under his cot pillow, where he never put anything, was a single folded piece of paper. He opened it. The message was typed, impersonal. Leave. This is your only warning. They had been inside his sanctuary. They had touched his things. It was a violation designed to unnerve him, to tell him he wasn't safe, not even here. It had the opposite effect. It enraged him. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He remembered the last lines of his father's journal, a part he had skimmed over before. If Croft finds you, and you can't get out, there is one man who might listen. A reporter named Alistair Finch. He was looking into some strange land deals back in the 90s. Croft ran him out of the state. Last I heard, he was living in retirement up near the Current River. He knew something was wrong even then. He might still have his notes. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead he had that existed outside of Croft's sphere of influence. He had the proof from Mary Beth. He had his father's journal. And now he had a name. He packed a small bag with the journal, the copies of the deeds, a burner phone, and the gold bar. He would find Alistair Finch. But first, he had to survive the night. He knew Croft wouldn't wait for him to leave. The warning was an ultimatum, and the deadline was now. The attack came just before midnight. Jack wasn't in the shed. He was positioned on a high ledge across the quarry, concealed in a thicket of scrub oak, a vantage point that gave him a clear view of the shed and the access ramp. He had his father's old hunting rifle, a bolt-action .30-06 he'd found in the footlocker, cleaned and oiled. Rogue was with him, silent as a shadow, the fur on his neck ridged. The dog heard them first, a low whine rumbling in his throat. A minute later, two figures emerged from the woods, moving in a low crouch. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by ski masks. They weren't soldiers. Their movements were clumsy, too loud. Hired muscle. One was carrying a crowbar, the other a 5-gallon can of gasoline. Their intent was obvious. They weren't there to talk. They were there to erase the problem, to burn the shed, destroy any evidence, and either kill him or send him running with nothing. Jack watched as they pried open the shed door, and one of them began sloshing gasoline inside. He didn't fire a warning shot. That wasn't how you ended a fight. You ended it quickly, decisively. He centered the rifle's crosshairs on the can of gasoline. He exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and the rifle bucked against his shoulder. The round struck the metal can, and the night erupted in a brilliant orange fireball. The shed, soaked in fuel, went up with a deafening whoosh. The man holding the can was thrown backward, screaming, his clothes on fire. The second man, stunned by the explosion, stumbled out of the doorway, momentarily blinded. Jack was already moving, working the bolt on the rifle, chambering another round as he scrambled down a game trail toward the quarry floor. He didn't need to kill them, just neutralize them. But they were between him and the hidden chamber. The fire illuminated the entire quarry, casting wild, dancing shadows. The man who had been on fire was rolling on the ground, trying to smother the flames. The other, recovering his senses, pulled a large hunting knife and saw Jack approaching. He charged, a guttural yell tearing from his throat. Jack dropped the rifle and met the charge. He used the man's momentum against him, deflecting the knife hand and driving his shoulder into the man's chest. They went down in a tangle of limbs, rolling on the wet gravel. The man was strong, fueled by adrenaline, but he was sloppy. Jack, moving with an economy born of 1,000 hours of hand-to-hand training, trapped the man's knife arm, twisted it, and felt the satisfying pop of the shoulder dislocating. The man howled in pain, the knife clattering to the ground. Before he could recover, Jack delivered a precise, disabling blow to the side of his neck, and the man went limp. Suddenly, a new threat. The first man had managed to put out the fire on his clothes. He was badly burned, but he was up, and he was coming at Jack from behind, a length of rusted pipe in his hand. "Jack!" A desperate bark from Rogue. The dog, who Jack had ordered to stay, had disobeyed. Rogue launched himself through the air, a 70-pound missile of black fur and fury, and slammed into the attacker's chest, knocking him off his feet. The man went down, but as he fell, he swung the pipe wildly. It caught Rogue across the ribs with a sickening, wet thud. The dog yelped, a sharp cry of pain, and collapsed, his leg twisting under him. A white-hot rage, cold and pure, flooded Jack's mind. It was the Korangal all over again, the fire, the smell of burning fuel, his dog down. He picked up the fallen knife and closed the distance to the last man in 2 strides. He didn't see a hired thug anymore. He saw the man who had hurt his dog. He put the blade to the man's throat. "Who sent you?" he snarled, the voice not his own. "Croft. Silas Croft," the man blubbered, terror in his eyes. "He just wanted the squatter gone. He said to burn the place, make it look like an accident." Jack pressed the blade harder, the man's life held by a razor's edge of his control. But then he heard Rogue whine, a weak, painful sound. The dog was trying to get up, his hind leg useless. The rage receded, replaced by a wave of cold dread. The dog was more important than revenge. He was the last living thing that connected Jack to who he used to be. He pulled the man to his feet, used zip ties he carried in his pack to bind both men's hands and feet, and then went to Rogue. The dog was breathing in shallow pants, his eyes glazed with pain. His side was a mass of bruised flesh, and his leg was clearly broken. Jack gently ran his hands over the dog, his touch as gentle as a surgeon's. "It's okay, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I got you. I got you." He used the captured thug's phone, which had survived the chaos, and dialed 911. He didn't ask for the county sheriff. He asked for the Missouri State Highway Patrol. "There's been an assault and arson at the old Callaway Quarry," he said, his voice steady and calm. "I have 2 suspects in custody, and an officer is down." He looked at Rogue, whose tail gave a single weak thump against the ground. A K-9 officer. He would use their language, their rules. He would make them listen. The line from his father's journal echoed in his mind. This is not his money. It belongs to the good men who died for it. He had made his stand. He had chosen the dog, chosen the truth, over the gold. The arrival of the state troopers was swift and professional. 2 cruisers, lights flashing but sirens silent, rolled down the access road within 30 minutes. They found a scene of controlled chaos. A still smoldering shed, 2 trussed-up and groaning men, and Jack calmly applying a makeshift splint to his dog's leg, using a branch and strips torn from his own shirt. He explained the situation in clipped, precise sentences, omitting the gold, but detailing the assault, the arson, and Croft's name. The troopers, seeing the burns, the dislocated shoulder, and the sheer competence with which Jack had handled the situation, listened. They took one look at Rogue, whining softly as Jack worked, and their demeanor softened. One of the troopers was a former K-9 handler himself. He helped Jack carefully lift Rogue into the back of his cruiser to be taken to an emergency vet in Springfield. "We'll make sure he's looked after," the trooper said, his eyes meeting Jack's with a look of professional respect. "You did a good job here." As the sun came up, the quarry was a state and federal crime scene. Investigators arrived, then men in dark suits with FBI credentials. The 2 thugs, desperate to cut a deal, started singing. They gave up Silas Croft, detailing his orders to burn the place to the ground and get rid of the vagrant who was squatting there. The net that Croft had woven for decades unraveled in a matter of days. The federal investigation, spurred on by the mention of a potential K-9 officer assault and the strange circumstances, dug deep. They connected Croft's name to a flag on a long dormant Cold War-era file, the disappearance of the contingency fund. Alistair Finch, the retired journalist, was contacted. He emerged from his quiet retirement with a box full of meticulously organized notes, interviews, and financial records from 20 years prior. A shadow investigation he had never abandoned. He had suspected a high-level military officer was buying up land under suspicious circumstances, but he could never get the final piece of the puzzle. Jack's father's journal was that piece. Mary Beth Aiken provided the forged deeds, the concrete proof of Croft's methods. Faced with a mountain of evidence and the testimony of his own hired men, Silas Croft was arrested at his sprawling ranch. The respected local developer was exposed as a murderer, a thief, and a traitor who had spent 40 years hunting the men who had refused to break their oath. The rest of the gold, hidden in the quarry, was recovered. Federal agents cataloged the ingots and bonds. A lost piece of history finally returned. The quarry, the worthless piece of land, had become the tomb of Croft's empire. Weeks later, Jack stood on the ledge overlooking the dark water. The air was clean, the silence broken only by the wind. The quarry was quiet again. Rogue was beside him, his leg in a cast, but his weight leaning solidly against Jack's. The vet said he'd have a permanent limp, but he would recover. He was a survivor, just like his master. In Jack's pocket was a letter. It wasn't from a lawyer or the government. It was from his daughter, Chloe. After the story broke, he had finally called her. He'd told her everything. About the Korangal, about his father, about the quarry. He didn't make excuses, he just gave her the truth. For the first time, she hadn't heard a broken man, but a father. Her letter was full of questions, of tentative hope, of a daughter wanting to know the grandfather she never met and the father she had lost. She was coming to visit. The government, in a quiet, off-the-record meeting, had designated a portion of the recovered funds as a reward, legally transferred to Jack as the heir of the man who had guarded it. It was a fortune, but it didn't feel like his. It felt like a debt. He remembered his father's words. Use it for them, for the good men who died for it. He knew what he had to do. The place he had come to disappear, the inheritance from a father he'd thought had abandoned him, had become the one place on earth he felt anchored. It had given him back his mission. He wasn't Sergeant Major Callahan anymore, and he wasn't a ghost. He was Daniel Callahan's son, and he had a promise to keep. The inverted closing of his life had begun. The place that looked like an end had become a beginning, all thanks to a loyal dog who never, ever gave up. Sometimes loyalty is the only thing that survives the fire, a dog who won't leave your side, a father's words that wait 40 years in the dark, a truth that refuses to stay buried. What do you think is the strongest bond a person can have? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to tell us where you're watching from tonight.